Good evening, and welcome to tonight's shiur. Parshas Matos-Masei. This Shabbos is Chazak. We're going to first look at a note of the Rebbe Rashab. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago about a new publication of excerpts from the Sefer haChayim from haChayim Falagy, which was discovered to have the Rebbe's library in Moscow, which is in Beshivya. So there's a volume. It's a small sefer, and it has lots of significant notes by the Rebbe Rashab on the margin of the sefer. Very interesting, because some of them are not comments on the sefer, but just record of minhagim, as for example the one which we're going to look at today. So this has been published about 2 months ago, and so we're going to look at one, and perhaps in the future we'll look at others too. So this entry is about the bowing at the end of Shmoine Esrei, or at the end of Kaddish. Actually, it's talking about the end of Kaddish. Now, it's in the Sephardi poetic style, so it's using Tov Bamidbar. It's playing on the words in Tehillim Kuf Zayin. Ika inshid Tov Bamidbar. There are people who make a mistake in the way they speak. V'yoimrim Kaddish Tiskabel. When they say Kaddish Tiskabel, they add the Mosifim V'ara. I'm sure you've heard this in some Bati Midrashim. And V'kodim Avun Dishmaya V'ara. L'fia Emes, so Reb Chaim says, V'toyar Avuno. This title, Our Father, the term which we have many times in Chazal is Avinu Shabashamayim. Therefore, we know the Eibush is all over, but the adoption of Avinu Shabashamayim is just Shabashamayim. We don't say Avinu Shabaoretz. This he quotes from the Sefer Yohrzeit Aleichem and the Sefer Kemach Soilas. Oitos acher murgal b'fi hakoil. Also, another common error is the be'oimram oise sholem v'chol kaddish yiyah ba'amido uva'amido. Every by the end of Kaddish and the end of Shmoine Esrei, oimnim yaseh sholem oleinu v'yachem v'omafsikin. You say yes, oise sholem oleinu v'yaseh sholem oleinu. Then Al Yisrael, Yisrael. And then they say a separate sentence. Instead, you should get used to saying it correctly. Yaseh Sholem, Yaseh Sholem. Yafsiku, and they should make pause. And then you should say Oleinu Al Yisrael. We don't have the word Amei. But Oleinu Al Yisrael, he says it should come together, and he gives a reference to earlier Siman Tesvav and their Bashmot Hashom, which we're not going to look at today. Okay. But meanwhile, on this comment about Oise Sholem Bimroimov, so here we have a note of the Rebbe Rashab. And as I note here, he's talking both of Kaddish and at Shmoine Esrei. When we step back and we say Oise Sholem. So now the Rebbe Rashab, as you see, it's not a comment, a correction or on the words of Reb Chaim Falagy. It's just registering a point. When you say Oise Sholem Bimroimov, Yishche Letzad Smoil, you bow to the left. Hu Yaseh Sholem Oleinu, Yishche Letzad Yamin. When you say Hu Yaseh Sholem Oleinu, you should bow to the right. V'al Kol Yisrael V'imru Amein Yishtachel Lefonov. When you say the last phrase, you bow forward. Now, in the Sefer Minhagim, and as you know, Sefer Minhagim is collated from earlier lists of Minhagim, which were put together by our Rebbe, noch b'chayav, the Frierdiker Rebbe possibly. So here in Sefer Minhagim, we have a difference in this between the bowing at the end of Shmoine Esrei and the bowing at the end of Kaddish. And it's interesting then that the Rebbe Rashab seems to be focusing here on Kaddish, because that's the main point over here. But you could say he also talks about Amido. Fine, but he doesn't differentiate between the two. But let's take a look what it says over here, that Hatoyas v'archonas hareish be'es amiyas shalom shel tfilas lachash. When you step back from your quiet Shmoine Esrei, when you say Oisa Shalom Imreimo, Hatoya v'archonas smoila mispal. You tilt your head and you bow slightly towards your left. And the reason is because it says in the Gemara, Mariyuma, that this is that you are taking leave, Kivyochel, and you are showing respect to the Shechina who is Kenegdoi. And so you bow to the left, which is the Min HaShechina Kivyochel, which is in front of you. But here there's a difference. Here the word who, he says who be'emsa. Who, Yas Sholem Aleinu, and then Ve'al Kol Yisrael. So Yas Sholem Aleinu is to your right, Al Kol Yisrael is be'emsa. So 2 points here, that whereas the guidance over here in the Rebbe Rashab's writing, his note is left, right, and middle. Whereas in this minhag, it's left, middle, yeah. Oisa Shalom to the left, who the middle, Yasa Shalom Aleinu is to the right, and then Al Kol Yisrael Omein be'emsa says left, middle, right, middle. So that makes a big difference, yeah. And in Spheres, we talk about Chesed, Gvur, and Tiferes. So it makes more sense the way it's in this earlier note of going directly from left to the right and then to the middle. All right, so that is so far, that's by the end of Shmoine Esrei. Before we go further, if Reb Chaim Falagy had a problem of Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael being separated, here you see, the minig is Yasa Shalom Aleinu, pause. And then Ve'al Kol Yisrael. So he does separate between Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael. Then we have also in the Sefer HaMinhagim, also from that note in Sefer Mamor and Tovshin Ches, when you finish Shmoine Esrei, when you finish Oisa Shalom Kaddish, this time it's Oisa Shalom Imreim to your right, who in the middle, Yasa Shalom Alein to the left, so it's the same sequence as the end of Shmoine Esrei, but here it's starting from the right rather than starting from the left. So again, the Rebbe Rashab does not differentiate between Kaddish or the end of Shmoine Esrei, but later we have from this Rishim of the Rebbe clearly that there's a different hanhoga between the end of Shmoine Esrei and the end of Kaddish. The end of Shmoine Esrei, you are, as I say, you are oimed lifnei hashchina, and you're bowing to your left, which is the right of the Shechina, which is connected. So why then, but Shmoine Esrei, why should the Kaddish be different? So in my Siddur, I have a whole section in the Miluim about Boi v'Sholom. At the end of L'chodoidi, when we bow, you bow first to the right, then to the left, or first to the left, then to the right. So brought there a few examples where Minhag Chabad is different to earlier Minhagim, and that is, for example, by Birchas HaTorah. So whereas in the Shulchan Aruch, Ramo says to bow to the left, and we when we say Baruch, we bow slightly to the right. A couple of other examples, and my hunch there is that there is a lot in the Gemara Sota that Koved Tzibur is greater than Koved Ashchin. So although when you are finishing Shmoine Esrei, so you bow to your left, which is a Koved Ashchina, which is the right of the Shchin. But when it's when you're speaking on behalf of a tzibur, you're a chazan, you're finishing on behalf of a tzibur, then you do the yamin of the tzibur rather than the yamin hashchina first. Now, that would also explain why Baruch, etc., is by Baruch by Halil Torah. in the Siddur there also, I have a quote from a Sefer Yaskil Avdi, Rebbe Hadaya, who wants to differentiate between Kaddish Teskabel, which is the end of davening, of Chazor Sashadz, is one way, and Kaddish, Stama Kaddish is different, which makes sense if you say that's got to do with Kovod HaTzibur, especially the Chazan is representing the Tzibur is stronger. Having said all this, we don't know what the Rebbe did at the end of Shmoine Esrei because it was quiet. We do know what the Rebbe did by Kaddish. By the Rebbe, it was Oise Sholem Bimreimov. That was his right, left, and so it was first the wording. Instead of having the three movements over three sentences or three phrases, it's over three words. Oise Sholem Bimreimov. Also, it's right, left, and middle without right, middle, left, middle. So I think a couple of years ago I discussed this at a shiur, and I have it written up in a lot of detail, sources from the Gemara, sources from the Zohar, Rabbi Nachum de Lonzano, Rabbi Yoina. If anyone wants to have the full article, you're welcome to reach out and I'll send it to you. Okay, so what we're having here then, the bottom line is we have a Hago of the Rebbe Rashab, which is we follow that sequence, possibly, at the end of Shmoine Esrei, and although he's saying that sequence at the end of Kaddish, and the end of Kaddish, we have the sequence the other way around. We start with it right, and then left, and then the middle. Okay, let's go on, and that is, I had the following question come my way. In a particular town, there's a non-form organization, but they have a policy that they do their events, they do them kosher. It turns out that they want to do an event in a hall on Succos. And so they've turned to the Kaddish authority. We want to do this event on whatever the day is in October or whatever. And it turns out it's Succos. So here's the question. You're going to serve a meal and you're going to be serving bread. That's part of it. We're not asking about Natilas Yadayim and benching. We're not going to that. You're going to be serving, that's part of what you're going to be serving, rolls, whatever. And it's outside the sukkah. So are you allowed to serve a meal outside the sukkah? And that's the question for the caterer. And of course, the question then goes back to the Kaddish authority. May they give a hechsher to this event, hashgacha for this event, when people are eating outside the sukkah, which is a bittul or mitzvah seminat Torah. That's the question. So we do find, I looked around and I could not find anything. It's such a common thing. You have restaurants which don't necessarily have a sukkah. A restaurant in Manhattan, never, don't necessarily have a sukkah. Are they allowed to be open on Succos, serving bread to their customers? So, but as I say, I didn't find this on record anywhere. But what we do have is here's from the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, about a mother and her son. Her son is over the age of chinuch for sukkah, because he's, as the Lashon is, if there's einot tzorach le'imoy, he's not so mamish dependent on his mother. He gets up in the morning, he can get dressed on his own. He doesn't need his mommy to dress him, etc. He's already of the age that he has to be in the sukkah. Now, the mother doesn't have technically the chiyuv to be mechanech her child, and therefore she's allowed to place food in front of the child, food, even though she knows that the little boy will not go into the sukkah to eat. He's going to eat it right there. And she's allowed to do so. She mustn't tell him he's going to eat. That she's not allowed to. There's nice weather outside, so he has to go into the sukkah. But she's allowed to serve him, even though the child, now here is talking about a question of chinuch. I'm not talking about a mitzvah min haTorah, but so it says she is allowed to place the food before him, and she doesn't have a chiyuv of chinuch. Now, could you use the same? Well, and why can't she tell him to eat? If she has no chiyuv of chinuch, why can't she tell him to eat? Well, that's very interesting. That even where we do not have a mitzvah of chinuch, and the lashon is koton oichel nevelos, we're not. If a child is eating treif, we're not mechuyev to stop him. But we mustn't encourage the child to eat treif. Certainly an adult, yeah. So there's it's not lifnei sit and michshol in the normal sense, because they can. You're not well, but you're still kind of encouraging them to do something wrong, or that you're not allowed. Okay. So here we have a source of feeding food to someone who's not going to eat in the sukkah. Well, here it's in the case of chinuch, but here we're talking about a mitzvah in Torah. Now, the truth is that the majority of the foods at this do are probably going to be foods that you can eat outside the sukkah. The meat and the potatoes and the salad, all of that you can eat outside the sukkah. But you can't escape that they're going to have rolls at the table, and those are chayiv b'sukkah. So this is our dilemma. So as I say, I could not find this addressed directly in contemporary poskim, but we do have something which is for the 9 days about butcher shops and restaurants, fleishike restaurants being open the 9 days. So the Ramah says, goin zinas hasakin, din shashchita. The shchita knife is put away. For the 9 days, it's put away. Except for Erev Shabbos, I guess. So here is a sefer Hari B'Somim, and he says if he's got a big child of a big city, and there's a lot of people who are not so particular, and if they don't find kosher food, they're going to eat treifa food. So he says you're allowed to shecht, you're allowed to sell the food. And he quotes here, although there is an expression, don't do a sin in order to save someone else from a sin, but here we say chatoi, do something wrong to save other people from eating treifas. So there's a meaning not to shecht. It's okay. Shecht, so those people shouldn't eat treif. Why? What's the pretext? Oh, well, perhaps they're buying meat for Shabbos. Perhaps they're making some other event like a bris or something, which is justified. But that doesn't help for a restaurant, because they're eating right now. So you can't be toile, it's for Shabbos, etc. Perhaps though, you can say they're not well, because they're not well, they're allowed to eat fleishiks. So does that help us in our situation? To say that the people who are coming to do this the Jewish ones, men, you can say they're cholim, and that's why they're allowed to eat indoors. Possibly. Just one more comment on this. There's a story told, well, there's a tshuva of the Noida Yehuda, that he was the Rov in Prague, and he allowed the Jewish barbers to be open on Chol HaMoed Pesach and Chol HaMoed Succos. And he gave various reasons, and he said also mitam hakomus. He has some secret reason which he doesn't want to divulge. And some have come to the idea that there were people in Prague who were not from Eden, and they would go to the barbers and have a shave, and the Jewish barbers would shave them with a shaver which is like a scissors, a close-cut scissors. If the Jewish barbers would be closed, those same people wouldn't have a problem to go to a Goyshe barber, and the Goyshe barber would use a razor. So the Noida Yehuda felt it's better that the Jewish barbers are open and giving haircuts on Chol HaMoed, which is against halacha, but that would be a saving, so that the Eden who are so far from halacha shouldn't go and have a job done with a razor. I heard that the Alter Rebbe said, at Yofa Kivani, that the Noida Yehuda had it right. His assessment and his conclusion was correct. I looked for it at this quote. I remember reading it several times. I didn't find the quote now, Okay, so we have this idea that when there's a greater problem going to happen, so it's correct that you should overlook a smaller problem. Certainly, eating the sukkah is less of a problem than eating treif. Yeah, this is a mitzvah saseh, this is a mitzvah lo saseh. The worry here is that if the kashrus authority turn down this organization, say we can't give you a kashrus for an event on sukkahs, it's possible they'll change their policy. They say we can't work with these kashrus agencies. They make too much life too difficult. We've got everything in place, and they cancelled it. And they may just go to have a non-kosher altogether. So that's the concern. And because of that, it's not as if the kashrus authority are actually giving the food, but I felt that it is justified that they should allow the kashrus, that the food should be kosher, even though they're eating outside the sukkah. I heard just this past Shiva B'Tammuz, there was a similar type of dilemma. There was a Levi in that Angedacht, somewhere here in England, and it was a Shiva B'Tammuz. And as it is common in some societies, that after the Levaya, there's a whole tea, cakes and tea, a whole thing. So they did this in the shul. So these people didn't know anything about fast day and far from any awareness. So you have a dilemma. Do I, as the rabbi of the shul, do I cancel this event? So you can't have it in the shul because it's a Shiva B'Tammuz. So what will happen? Or shall they go to a local restaurant and do it there? They'll do it without kashrus, yeah? And none of them are fasting anyway. It's a question of Chil Hashem. It's Chil Hashem that a shul should host a party of sorts on a fast day. That's true. The question is, would cancelling and objecting to such an event in such a clueless community, would that possibly be a bigger Chil Hashem? Saying that the Rabbanim don't understand the community altogether. So, Shebal Taiseh, that's what happened. And I think he was right. Right, let's move on to the next question. So, it's if you don't have a gas flame, so in order to be able to light Neiris Yomtov for the second night of Yomtov, so it's people prepare a candle, a Yohrzeit candle, and so it comes towards the second eve of Yomtov. They'll take a flame from the Yohrzeit candle and light the candles for the second night. Here's the question. The Yohrzeit candle went out. But you do have another flame. So let's say it's the first night of Yomtov, the Yohrzeit candle which you've lit before the Zman has now gone out, and so you don't have the means to light candles on the second night of Yomtov. Are you allowed to light this candle or another Yohrzeit candle on the first day of Yomtov, exclusively for the purpose of using it to light on the second night of Yomtov? Now, we're not allowed to do melacha on Yomtov for after Yomtov. So the second night of Yomtov, in relation to the first day of Yomtov, is a Yom Chol. So are you allowed to light a candle on the first day of Yomtov, so that you should have with what to light your candles the second day of Yomtov, the second eve of the second day of Yomtov? So that's a problem. And what I can see here is the following. Here we have, this is from, on the top of the screen, is from Tov Kuf Chof Zayin. That's the siman all about Eruv Tafshil. So you have the situation where someone does not have an Eruv Tafshil, and if it's in a community, well, no community, if it's in a community where there's a Rov, you can rely that the Rov And ask him, and the Rov will. Middle of the shiur, I can't speak. So then you didn't make Erev Shilin, you can rely that the Rav made Erev Shilin. But if you are in the shlichus in a small place, whatever, there's no one else to rely upon. So now you're stuck. You have no Erev Shilin, and you forgot to make your Erev Shilin. So what can you do? So there is a permission to do mamish kedei chayav, bare minimum. And so it says here, there's no one else to. If you can give away your food to someone else to cook for you, if you don't have anyone else to give it to you, to give it to. Hitiru lechachamim. Lahochin kol tzorchei Shabbos b'tzimtzum kedei chayav. You can prepare bare minimum for Shabbos. You'll bake one bread, which is not going to be relevant for us because everything's baked before. V'yavashel kedei ra'achas. You'll cook one pot of food to have cooked food for Shabbos. And you light one candle. So you can't light all the candles you normally light because you didn't make Erev Shilin. Now, Lemaisa, digressing for a moment, nowadays I would say you can't light even a single candle because you've got electricity. You're not bumping into anything. So the only thing you could do is bread you have anyways. If you needed to cook and you don't have food for Yomtov for Shabbos, you'd be allowed to cook one pot. Okay. Meanwhile, he says that you can only light one candle for where you're going to be eating. The rooms elsewhere, you wouldn't be allowed to light a candle in L'Tzorech Shabbos. Only where you're eating. Then he adds, you could go into another room towards the late afternoon and to look for something there. So you'll take with a candle, you'll light a candle from a candle, and you'll use that candle to go and look for something. You'll make an excuse. And then once the candle is there, so you can leave it in the other room. Like this, you'll have light in the other room. So here we have a besashtikal eitzah. So this, coming back to our situation, it's the first night of Yomtov. The Yohrzeit candle has gone out, and you're worried where you're going to light, how you're going to light the second night. So what you do have an eitzah is to light the Yohrzeit candle and take it to a bedroom or something with a roof that you can use it to find socks, find your slippers, whatever it may be. Can use this candle for an activity on the first night of Yom Tov, and once that is done, then you keep the candle wherever you keep it. That doesn't matter. So you've found a good excuse. All right, that's one eitzah. Now, another eitzah, which is very, very good to know, that there is a rule that shvus letzorech mitzvah is permitted. You're allowed to do an isud rabbonon. Sorry, yeah, you're allowed to do isud rabbonon letzorech mitzvah. So to ask a goy to do an isud rabbonon letzorech mitzvah is allowed. So it comes the second night of Yom Tov, and the Rebbetzin wants to light the candles. She doesn't have a flame, so you can go to a goy and ask the guy to strike a match and light a candle for you. Then you use that candle to light the other ones. So that's because striking a match on Yom Tov is not an Issa Derais. On Yom Tov, striking a match is an Issa Rabbanon of Moilid, or creating something new. That's the Issa Rabbanon. So then you're allowed to ask a guy to strike a match, then you should be able to light your Yom Tov mitzvah. So now you're going to ask, I've got to hear, if I have such easy eitzah to ask a guy to strike a match, why do I have to start preparing a Yohrzeit candle? And here we have a chiddush of the Alter Rebbe. I don't know whether it's written in other poskim. The Alter Rebbe says, you cannot, before Yom Tov, you cannot rely on the eitzah of shvus de shvus and asking a guy to do an act for you, shvus de shvus l'sech mitzvah. The Alter Rebbe is laying down the psak that the idea that you can ask a guy to do this rabbanon And the tzarich mitzvah is only in a b'diavad situation. You cannot plan it that way. Therefore, you have to plan. You have to prepare your Yohrzeit candle. If that goes out, then you have a heter to ask a goy to strike a match. When sometimes we have a similar situation, we've gone through this perhaps before, having second night Seder, can you have goyim set the table to be able to start the Seder at a reasonable time? So to prepare from day one to day two, this is Rabbanon. So it's the tzarich mitzvah. Are you planning it that way? But it's kind of a b'diavad situation. And because you don't have another room, if you had another room to prepare before Yomtov, you prepare the other room. But this is the given situation, so it's a kind of shas adchak, but it's not a simple heter. What I do remember, we have a shluchim chat group here in London, in England rather, and when it came Erev Pesach Shechal B'Shabbos, so a number of the shluchim shared pictures that already on Friday the room for the Seder on Motzei Shabbos was all set, so they didn't have to rely on coming in on Shabbos afternoon to set the table, because lechatchila that shouldn't be done. Lechatchila it should be done by bisman when you're allowed to do malacha. But when that's not an option, then we're going to rely on Shabbos and tzarich mitzvah. Let's move on. So here, one of our regular listeners asks us that she lives in a warm place, and she has to get on the bus. And normally she uses the time to say Tillim, whatever it may be. And the bus is full of people who think they're going to the beach, and they're already dressed for the beach or undressed for the beach. So are you allowed to say Tillim in their presence, or brachas, etc.? So we're looking at Siman Ayin Hey in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan. It says if a tefach, which is normally covered, if that is imegule, if that's uncovered, so then that's called an erva. And v'lochein osur likrois v'lispal kenegdo. So you've got different levels in erva. And what is being said here is a tefach of flesh, which is normally covered and is now exposed, so you wouldn't be allowed to say a bracha or daven, learn Torah in that presence. So that means on the bus where you got people who are uncovered, where parts which are normally covered, you would have a problem of saying a bracha, etc. Let's read further. V'yesh matirin. Now those who say it's not a problem in einu mistakel by, so long as you're not looking that way, afilu roya oisa b'havora b'yalam, even though it is in your view, but in passing, not focus, kiven she'enoi erva. It's not essentially erva. It's just shemevile dehirur. It's when you're looking at something which is provocative, it brings your thoughts on sneersdika thoughts. And that provocation is only relevant when it's looking that way. It's in passing, it doesn't provoke your machshavos. Certainly, if you close your eyes, then you'd be allowed to say your tilim, your chumash, etc. And you don't have to turn away. So turning away is one eitzah. But then we have here, if it's in your general view, but you're not looking that way, you would be allowed to continue saying your tilim, etc. And although not everyone agrees, the Alter Rebbe says, you know what? I've written about this in the first volume of the Sivim Zeh. What do you do when it comes? You have a Friday night, you have a guest, married woman who doesn't cover her hair. It's also a tefach megule, whatever it's sarbe isha ervo. So it's going to be the same thing not to look in her direction, and to look in the siddur, etc. Or you close your eyes. But if you can't, even without closing your eyes, so long as you're not looking in that direction, that's okay. So that's number one. There is a heter to continue davening so long as you're not looking that way. Then what about, this is a man. What about a woman? Does a woman have a problem when another woman is not dressed, not covered? So the Alter Rebbe in Sif Bey says, this whole idea that's shiur, etc., that's primarily addressing men. But a woman, first of all, a woman who is undressed is allowed to say, she's allowed to daven, because her erva, as in the lower parts, is covered because she's sitting. And the fact that she's not dressed, that's a problem for men. It's bringing them into a hero to not good thoughts. And as a result, even one woman would be allowed to say brocha daven in the presence of another woman who's not dressed properly, unless you're talking about mamish, erva mamish, which is, that's not what we're talking about. There are those who disagree with this, and they say that one woman would not be allowed to say a brocha in the presence of another woman who's uncovered. So therefore, we're coming to this question of this lady on the bus, with the people who think they're going to the beach, that if she's just looking at her tilim without focusing on the exposures around her, she's allowed to continue, and even for a woman to is more lenient, even if she is looking that way, she's also allowed to say brachas, etc., because the shiur doesn't apply to a woman seeing another woman. Let's move on to the next shaila. Okay, now I don't know whether you printed out the list of questions, and if you did, I sent out 9 questions, and then I realized I actually had a 10th question to make up our minion, and I'd forgotten to put on the list. So, but I'm going to share that with you anyways. So someone came to me last Friday, and he asks me, what is our minhag about my macharonim? How much do we wash? How much of the fingers do we wash when we do my macharonim? So in the Shulchan Aruch, it says Sim Kuf Pei Aleph that you only need to wash the lower 2 joints of the fingers. In other words, the top, the one which is closest to the palm, doesn't need to be washed because it doesn't come into contact with food. The reason for my machronim is because people would eat with their fingers, and so the fingers are greasy, etc. But the higher part of the fingers, closer to the palm, doesn't touch the food, and therefore doesn't need to have my machronim. See what the Mishnah Berurah comments. I'm upset to see that people are trying to do my machronim, but they're not yotzei at all, because they just take a couple of drops at the tips of their fingers, and even the first joint of their fingers isn't washed. And sometimes they just touch a little bit of water with their fingers, and their fingers remain dirty and greasy. Be'emes min adin, you have to wash at least until the second, the first 2 joints, first 2 lower joints of the fingers. So that's the Mishnah Berurah. All right, so now, then we have here the haChayim. haChayim again in Siman Kuf Pei Aleph. He says, he quotes a Sefer Shulchan Arba, which I didn't look up, that you should wash my machronim all the way till where the fingers finish. In other words, all the way till where the fingers join the palm. And he says the Beis Yosef quotes this Sefer. Then he says, look back in Siman Zokeh in Kof Nun Zayin, where I've quoted from the Arizal, that of my machronim, you have to wash all 14 joints of the hand, which means the 4 fingers, which each have got 3 joints, that makes 12. And then the thumb, which has got 2 joints, therefore you've got 14. Word yad is 14, as we know. So he's quoting from the Arizal that one should be washing my machronim, the full fingers. And then he quotes Linyan Dino, one has to wash the entire fingers, because that's according to the Arizal. So now he refers us to Simon Kufnu Zayin. So let's take a look, and on this right of the screen, Kufnu Zayin from the haChayim, where he quotes here. It's all Kabbalah language about gematrias of the Shem area, etc. And it mentions here about the 14 joints of the fingers, and fine. Sheyitel hadal etzbois, yechaven shehem keneged dal the oisius of the mole, and whatever. Okay, so we do have, and this is where this fellow was coming from. We do have a strong emphasis on mayim achronim, washing a lot more than what we do, yeah. So here we have in Hayom Yom, and this is, as you see, it's Dalet Kislev. Mayim achronim noitling ktseyo etzbois, quite different. We just wash the tips of the fingers. Just exactly what the Mishnah Berurah was complaining about. Indeed, that's our minhag. After having wetted the tips of our fingers, we pass the wet fingers as they are still moist over the lips. Fine. So that's so he's asking. So I quoted this to last Friday. I told him this is min Chabad ketzeho etzbois. He's asking, where does it come from? As you see, and here you got a quote from the Arizal to wash the whole fingers. Generally, we do follow minhag Arizal. So if earlier I quoted from the haChayim, here we have another quote from the haChayim. This is haChayim Falagy, and he goes on. Let's read the section. When you wash mayim achronim, we say before zeh chelik adam rasha. Chelik adam rasha is rasha tevis acher. That's the idea. It's washing your fingers is as if the water is going to sitra achra. It's giving some kind of benefit to sitra achra. Because that's yeah. Now, I did mention this in the past, how the Frierdiker Rebbe says not to have a silver dish for mayim achronim. Silver dish you give for a choshev thing, but for mayim achronim, which is going for sitra achra, don't celebrate them with a silver dish. But because of this, one should be putting only ma'at mayim al yodo, a little bit of water, not to give generously to sitra achra. And therefore he says, lo toiv. Some people, sometimes their hands are quite greasy, they go and wash them with a generous amount of water. He says, no, don't give sitra achra too much. Just the fingertips. And then here, actually, I got these references from the haChayim in an earlier seif. If in Kuf Pei Aleph, that was Succos Yud Zayin, Succos Vov, he gives us these references. So I don't understand how he didn't see the contradiction. So he gives us a reference to also the Chidah, and this is a pirush on the Haggadah from the Chidah. I'm going to read this. Ad Beirach. Yizohe little mayim achronim koyim b'chas hamozim. Okay, wash mayim achronim before benching. But tzorich sheyiyu mayim mu'otim al roshi etzba'isa. It should only be a little bit of water. And he says clearly roshi etzba'isa, which is very similar to ktseyo etzbois, which is in the Sefer Hayom Yom. Shelo yanika l'sitra achre harbe. Not to give a generous yanika for the sitra achre. Shamanu ke'arav achosid Reb Yehuda chavilamu zal eira loy masa nifla bozeh. I was curious, what's this masa nifla? I did not find, perhaps I can't even read it properly. Never heard of the name before. He quotes that someone had a masa nifla bozeh. So if you're asking where does the minhag Chabad of Ktseyo Etzbois come from, so you can see you've got the Chidah writes this way, Chaim Falagy writes this way. So there are those Al-Pikam Kabbalim who are saying to actually have only a minimal amount. I do remember we had this discussion a couple of years ago, and Rebbe Rashab sent me a clip of the Rebbe washing mayim achronim, and as his comment was, it wasn't as if it was just mamish a drop. It was pouring water, yes, but on the other hand, the meaning is just Roshi Etzbois. That's where we're coming from. Is there a difference between Roshi Etzbois, Ksei Etzbois? Okay, that I'm not going to go into. Right. So what happens then? What do you do with the Kisvei Arizal? So my suggestion is there's nowhere mafurish that you have to wash in the Kisvei Arizal here. You have to have in mind the Yudalad. When you buy Machron, you should have in mind that there are 14 joints to the hand, to the fingers. That's the kavana. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do so in mice. That's the way I could reconcile the minute which the Chidor writes with what's quoted from the Arizal. Right, let's move on. So last week we had a discussion about children, Havdalah for children on Sunday morning. And I had quoted from that because Sunday morning is only Hashloma, therefore you don't have to be mechanech a child to be a Hashloma to compensate where they missed out. So someone wrote to me and he says, actually, there's a debate in Poskim. What is exactly the Havdalah on the morning? Is it a Hashloma or is it more than that? Now, a couple of differences. He says, some Sofer says it's a Hashloma, but the Alter Rebbe says it's not a Hashloma. Two differences, Lamais. Number one, normally Hashloma is to make up if you missed by mistake. But if you missed knowingly, you don't normally have the opportunity of Hashloma. The Alter Rebbe says befurish that if someone didn't make Havdalah, Bein Bezod and Bein Bishgoga, he can on Matzah Shabbos, he can still make it on Sunday morning and so on until Tuesday. That's number one. So you see, the Alter Rebbe doesn't see it as a Hashlom. He sees it's a mitzvah of Havdalah, and it's a 3-day stretch. Yes, its best time is to do it Matzah Shabbos, but it's not Tashlumin if you do it on Sunday. The other difference is, I'm going to give it a couple of minutes, is on Nishdafin and Oinon. And Oinon is exempt of doing mitzvahs. So if the Oinon, well, in the morning was Oinon, and then there was Levaya, and after the Levaya, he has to be, Oinon doesn't say any brachas. Comes after the Levaya, so now he has to say brachas. Does he have to say Birchas HaShachar? And the answer is no, because in the morning he had no chiyuv to say Birchas HaShachar, and because he didn't have a chiyuv to say Birchas HaShachar, therefore he doesn't have to do Hashloma. He doesn't have to make up. And therefore, after the Levaya, the Oval now will not say Birchas HaShachar, he will say Birchas HaTorah, because he wants to learn Torah. Now, coming back, if it was a case where a person was an Oinen Motzei Shabbos, could be that there was the Petira was before Shabbos, didn't manage to do a Kvura, or the Petira was on Shabbos, and he comes now, it's Motzei Shabbos, he can't do Havdalah. So there's an Eitzah to make Havdalah without fire, to daven Ma'ariv from Plaga Mincha, but he's not an Oinen yet because he can't do Melacha, and also to do Havdalah again without a flame, to do Havdalah earlier on after Plaga Mincha. So like this, he's done the mitzvah of Havdalah, and then otherwise if he waits for later, he will miss out. Coming back to our topic, so we're talking about, is Havdalah Motzei Shabbos the primary time, and any other time it's Tashlumin, or is it no, that it's a 3-day slot where you, and the ideal time is on Motzei Shabbos, but it can be done later also. So that would be enough coming also with the Oinen, etc. So despite what he's right, that the Alter Rebbe doesn't see it as Tashlumin, he sees it as a 3-day stretch when you can do the mitzvah. But still, you can see here from the Sefer Shefer Takahosi, contemporary, and he says, still, when it comes to chinuch, we mechanech a child in the lechatchila way. So the lechatchila way is to do Havdalah, Motzei Shabbos. To do Havdalah on Sunday morning, that's not the lechatchila way. It's not necessarily, it's called Tashlumin. It's still not the lechatchila way, and therefore it doesn't. You don't have to do a havdalah for the child on Sunday morning. I have heard in some places they had chadorim, etc. They would do havdalah on Sunday morning. That's very nice, but I don't think that's the across the board minhag at all. He raises another interesting point. If you train the child that throughout the summer he does havdalah on Sunday morning, it's kind of also training the child. That's almost like lechatchila, which is all right. That's a concern. Okay, we have a couple of points in the chat, and we're going to look at them now. Three things. Tisha B'Av, which is on Sunday, requires havdalah on Sunday morning. No, wait till Matzah Tisha B'Av. Although the Rosh says it's actually skipped totally, but we don't pass them that way. Right, on Sunday evening. Thank you. Yeah. Right. That's. And this is machlokes haposkim. The point we follow that. Right. Let's move on. Now, point 7 was about the clarification about the widow's peak dilemma. So it's a serious machlokes haposkim whether the tefillin have to be mamish. And there's two discussions, in Yonim the Gemara. One says that the fact that tefillin have to be above the hairline is learned from Korcha. Another one is that it's learned got to do with the union of tzaras, where the tefillin have to be where there could be a tumas nega tzaras, and therefore, if it's a narrow widow's peak, so then the tefillin would have to be only on where the hair would have grown originally. Okay, it's someone has the shiur lemaisa, one should ask for advice. Let's move on. We also had a discussion last week about voice to text, and in my discussion, I was asking what is really the difference between standing in front of a screen and being videoed and talking to a machine which is translating your words into text. So one of our listeners is telling me that there's much more, standing in front of a video camera, there's really minimal change happening. The fact that there's someone dancing in front of the camera makes really minimal change in the functioning of the. On the other hand, voice to text, it's actually a whole process, which at least nowadays it's also a big chiddush that it happens. So there's much more of a activity. It's true, it's all automatic. So that's just to finish off that point, that voice to text is different to being recorded on a video, because there's a question of ksav she'eino miskayim. Let's say to write on the window. You've got condensation on the window, and to write on the window on the condensation. You're not allowed to do that midrabanon, it's a ksav she'eino miskayim. Or to write your name in sand. A few minutes, there'll be a bit of wind and it will go away. But even if it lasts for a few minutes only, it's also midrabanon. So the difference between a record of an image on a video, which is just managed for a second, whereas the voice to text, it has to give it enough time for the person to read it. So it does have to last for a couple of seconds. So therefore it does go into the issue of creating a ksav she'eino miskayim. We're not going to the electricity side, but it is certainly a short-term ksav, which wouldn't be okay. Last shiur also, we had a discussion about the people who would go and check out the Azorah with torches. And on Shabbos, they wouldn't carry the torches because of muksa. And I had asked, why is it just muksa? Why is it not also because of like a lamp with oil, and the oil is swaying? You wouldn't be allowed to move an oil lamp on Shabbos. So that's because Isra de Manatoira. So why is the Rebbe asking it's just Isra de Rabbanon? So one of our listeners sent him to me a comment that when we talk about torches, it's not talking about a lantern. We're talking about a piece of cloth which is soaked in paraffin or oil, and that's what the torch is. And therefore, it's not like there's a little pool of oil which is going to be swaying back and forth, like the case which I brought in from the lantern which is on the back of a door, that when you open and close the door, it's causing the oil to sway. Which is, he's right in that sense, that's typically what a torch was. But I wonder, the discussion here is about Shabbos morning, early morning. How could there be a torch with the way he's describing, which will last 8 hours, etc.? Normally such a thing lasts for a short while. I am not aware of those things lasting for hours and hours. So, fine. Finally, we had, if you remember, there was a woman had asked me that she had money put aside and she thinks she might owe someone that money. She's not sure. Let's say she was paying the person in installments, and she's not sure whether this £50 which she has in this envelope is that the last installment or not. And the person who she owed the money is also not sure. So she's worried if she gives the £50 extra and she doesn't owe it, so then it's going to be a question of ribbis. That was the discussion back then. So someone sent me in a very cute incident. There were two Chassidim who lived in Crown Heights. We can say the names, was Isaac Popak and Zalman Garari, and they had the question about $5,000, and it was between there wasn't they weren't sure whether he does owe or doesn't owe. Don't know which way it was, and the way they resolved was that they're going to give whoever had the money was going to give $5,000 to tzedakah, and the agreement was like this: that the Eibishter does know whether he owes the money or not. So the 5,000, the mitzvah, the £5,000 for tzedakah, in Himmel, the Beis Shalmailo, they will allocate it to whomever was entitled to the money, and that way they resolved their dilemma what to do with about the 5,000, which they weren't sure whether it was owed or not. A very nice story. And with this, I wish you all a good Shabbos and Yohov Yom Elu, Sos and Simcha, L'Moed and Tovim.